Christmas Eve used to mean something. Now it was just another workday in my corner office, 30 stories above a city blanketed in lights I no longer cared to look at. I had everything: power, wealth, global influence, but no one to share it with. The champagne in my glass tasted like metal. Even the fake laughter at the company's holiday gala couldn't drown out the silence inside me. I stayed late, of course. No one tells a CEO to go home. The London skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt. Rothwell Industries had become my identity, my purpose, my prison. Tonight, like most nights, I found myself reviewing acquisition papers rather than celebrating the holiday season. My office was immaculate, sterile, even. Modern art hung on walls I never truly looked at anymore. Awards lined glass shelves, trophies of battles won in boardrooms across continents. What good were they now? Just brass and crystal gathering dust while another Christmas passed unnoticed. The champagne, a rare vintage costing more than what my employees made in a month, sat barely touched. I couldn't even enjoy the luxuries my wealth afforded me anymore. 52 years old, at the peak of my career, and utterly alone. My assistant, Margaret, had finally gone home after I insisted. Her loyalty came at a price few could afford, but she was the closest thing to family I had these days. My parents were long gone. No siblings. No wife. Not anymore. Just an empire built on calculated decisions and sacrificed relationships. The holiday party downstairs had ended hours ago. I'd made my obligatory appearance, smiled for the cameras, gave the same speech about the Rothwell family I gave every year. But we weren't a family. We were a corporation. The distinction had blurred for me years ago. I loosened my tie, a small act of rebellion against my own rigid standards. The city below continued its Christmas Eve bustle, families rushing to last-minute dinners, couples walking hand-in-hand through light-strewn streets, children wide-eyed with anticipation for tomorrow morning. I used to be one of them, back when Christmas meant warm fires and genuine laughter. My phone buzzed again, the 5th time in the last hour. Unknown number. Probably some reporter hoping to catch me off guard for a quote about our controversial expansion into Eastern markets. Or perhaps a competitor, thinking the holiday might have softened my defenses. I silenced it without a glance. The massive Christmas tree in the plaza below caught my eye. 100 feet of twinkling defiance against the winter darkness. I remembered when such sights filled me with wonder rather than cynicism. When did that change? Was it when Caroline left? Or when I missed my father's funeral for a merger in Tokyo? Perhaps it was gradual, like a slow-spreading frost. I poured another glass of champagne I knew I wouldn't drink and turned back to my desk. The documents awaiting my signature represented another billion added to our portfolio. Another victory. Another empty triumph. My phone lit up again. This time, I noticed a text from Margaret. Urgent. Just that one word. Margaret never used that word lightly. In 15 years, she'd sent it exactly twice, when my father died and when our Frankfurt office faced that embezzlement scandal. When the unknown number called again, I answered, irritation edging my voice. Rothwell speaking. The voice on the other end was soft, professional. A woman. Mr. Rothwell? This is Nurse Bennett from St. Vincent's Hospital. My irritation faltered. Hospitals never called with good news. I'm calling about Julia Harrington, she continued. The name hit me like a physical blow. Julia. My blood seemed to slow in my veins. The office suddenly too quiet, too still. I hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in 3 years. I'd trained myself not to think it, not to remember her face or the way she used to laugh. Sir, I understand this is unexpected, but you're listed as her emergency contact. Miss Harrington has just given birth to a son. My grip tightened on the phone. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Mr. Rothwell. Her voice softened further. I'm very sorry to tell you that there were complications. Miss Harrington experienced severe hemorrhaging. We did everything we could. The implication hung in the air between us. I couldn't process it. Julia, a baby. My mind raced to connect dots that couldn't possibly align. Sir, the nurse said gently, the baby is healthy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Born at 11:42 p.m. But he has no other family listed. Miss Harrington specifically named you as the father on the birth certificate. My world tilted on its axis. Father. The word echoed in my head, foreign and impossible. I think you have the wrong number, I said automatically, corporate instincts kicking in, denying liability. But then Nurse Bennett said her full name. Julia Elizabeth Harrington. Born September 3rd, 1990. She has a small birthmark on her right shoulder blade. She was admitted at 4:15 this afternoon. Details only I would know. Details that confirmed this wasn't some elaborate mistake or cruel prank. This was real. Julia had been pregnant. Julia had given birth. Julia was gone. And somewhere in St. Vincent's Hospital was a child. My child, completely alone on Christmas Eve. Sir, are you there? You need to come immediately. I stood up, my body moving before my mind could catch up. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I ended the call and stared at the London skyline, seeing nothing. My phone buzzed with another text from Margaret. Car waiting downstairs. I've cleared your schedule for the next week. Of course she had. Margaret probably knew more about what was happening than I did. I grabbed my coat and left the office, champagne forgotten, acquisition papers and signed. The elevator descended 30 floors, but it felt like I was falling much further. Outside, snow had begun to fall, delicate flakes dancing in the glow of Christmas lights. My driver waited, silent and efficient, holding the door open to my sleek black Bentley. As we pulled away from Rothwell Tower, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, the empire I'd built seemed utterly insignificant compared to what awaited me at St. Vincent's. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't check the markets before leaving. I didn't call legal. All the protective instincts I'd cultivated over decades of business simply vanished. There was only one thought pulsing through my mind as we drove through London's emptying streets. Julia had my child, and now she was gone. I hadn't heard her name in 3 years. Julia, just hearing it made my chest ache like someone had reached in and pressed down on old scars I thought had faded. She'd been everything once, warmth in a world that rewarded coldness. But I chose the company. I always did. She walked away without asking for anything. Or so I thought. The Bentley glided through London's streets, now nearly empty as midnight approached on Christmas Eve. Holiday lights blurred through the windows, tinting the snowfall in reds and greens. My driver, Giles, kept silent, sensing my need for quiet. I was grateful for that small mercy. Julia Harrington. When we met, she'd been photographing the protest outside our Manchester facility, not as a protester, but as a photojournalist for The Guardian. I'd been immediately struck by her integrity, her refusal to be intimidated by my security team. While everyone else saw the fearsome CEO of Rothwell Industries, she saw through me somehow. Your company is displacing families for that development, she'd said, camera hanging around her neck, her gaze unflinching. We're creating jobs, I'd countered. At what cost? She'd asked, and somehow, by the end of that week, we were having dinner at Claridge's. Our relationship defied logic. She lived in a modest flat in Camden, surrounded by books and cameras and mismatched furniture collected from her travels. I owned penthouses in 7 countries, each one designed by famous architects, each one feeling less like home than the last. She challenged everything I believed about success. For 3 years, she showed me a different kind of life, until I pushed her away. The memory surfaced painfully as we approached St. Vincent's, our last argument in the conservatory of my Hampstead estate. The spring rain pounding against the glass ceiling, orchids blooming all around us while our relationship withered. It's Paris again, isn't it? She'd asked, already knowing the answer. The board meeting can't be moved. The Mercier acquisition is worth millions, I know. Her voice had been soft, resigned. There's always an acquisition, always a meeting, always a crisis only you can solve. This is who I am, Julia. This is my life. Her eyes, those perceptive hazel eyes, had filled with tears she refused to let fall. No, Edward. This is your job. There's a difference. I'd been stubborn, defensive. I've built this company from nothing. I can't just— I'm not asking you to give up Rothwell, she'd interrupted. I'm asking if there's room in your empire for me. For us. For a future that isn't measured in stock prices. I hadn't answered. That had been answer enough. She'd left the next morning. No dramatics, no demands, no threats to sell her story to the tabloids. Just a note on the pillow. I hope you find what you're looking for, Edward. Thank you for everything. As if I'd done her a favor rather than broken her heart. I never contacted her afterward. Pride, perhaps, or fear, or the simple fact that she deserved better than a man who put quarterly reports above love. I'd thrown myself back into work, expanded into new markets, acquired competitors, built my empire higher, bigger, emptier. And now this. A child. Our child. A life created in those final weeks before she left, perhaps? Or had she discovered it later? Had she tried to reach me? My mind raced with questions as the hospital came into view, its windows glowing softly against the night sky. "We're here, sir," Giles said quietly, pulling me from my thoughts. St. Vincent's was one of London's oldest hospitals, yet thoroughly modern inside. The lobby was decorated for Christmas, a modest tree in the corner, paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling. At this hour, it was nearly deserted save for the night staff and the occasional worried family member. The woman at reception recognized me immediately. My face appeared often enough in the financial pages. Her eyes widened slightly before professionalism took over. "I'm here about Julia Harrington," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She made a quick call, and moments later, a woman in scrubs approached. "Mr. Rothwell? I'm Nurse Bennett." We spoke on the phone. She was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and an expression that balanced sympathy with clinical detachment. She led me through quiet corridors, speaking in hushed tones. "Ms. Harrington was admitted in active labor this afternoon. The pregnancy had been high risk. Her blood pressure was concerning throughout. She began hemorrhaging shortly after delivery. The doctors did everything possible, but..." She paused, allowing the unspoken to settle between us. "Did she?" I struggled to form the question. "Was she conscious?" "After..." Nurse Bennett nodded. "Briefly. She held the baby. She named you as the father and asked that you be contacted immediately. She seemed very certain you would come." That certainty pierced me. After everything, she still believed in me more than I deserved. "She left this for you." Nurse Bennett handed me a small envelope, "and she asked that you be taken to see your son right away." My son. The words still felt impossible, disconnected from reality. "There are forms, of course," she continued, professional despite the circumstances. "But those can wait until morning. For now, I thought you might want to see him first." We stopped outside the neonatal unit, a room of soft lights and gentle beeping monitors. Through the glass, I could see rows of bassinets, some occupied, some empty. Nurse Bennett pointed to one in the corner. "There he is. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect health. We've been calling him Baby Boy Harrington until..." She trailed off, leaving me to fill in the blank. "Until I gave him a name. Until I claimed him. Until I decided whether to accept this responsibility or walk away as I'd done from his mother." "I'd like to see her," I said suddenly. "Julia." Before. Nurse Bennett's expression softened. "Of course. The morgue is downstairs. But perhaps you might want to meet your son first?" She was very clear about that. She wanted you to see him immediately. Even now, Julia was guiding me, knowing what I needed before I did myself. She understood that seeing her lifeless body first would break something in me, might make it impossible to face the child we'd created. I nodded, unable to speak. Nurse Bennett led me into the neonatal unit, the air warm and humming with the sounds of machines and occasional infant cries. We approached the bassinet in the corner, and for the first time, I saw him. He was impossibly small, swaddled in a hospital blanket patterned with tiny red reindeer. His face was round, slightly flushed, with a button nose that unmistakably resembled mine. Dark lashes rested against plump cheeks, and a wisp of dark hair, Julia's color, curled from beneath a knitted cap. Something shifted in me then, a tectonic movement. In my chest, realigning everything I thought I knew about myself. This wasn't just any child. This was our child. Mine and Julia's. A perfect amalgamation of us both. "Would you like to hold him?" Nurse Bennett asked gently. I nodded, suddenly aware of how unprepared I was. My hands, which confidently signed billion-pound contracts, now trembled at the prospect of cradling this tiny life. She lifted him carefully, expertly, and placed him in my arms, adjusting my hold until his head was properly supported. He weighed almost nothing, yet felt like the most significant thing I'd ever held. His eyes opened then, unfocused, newborn blue, yet somehow seeing straight through me just as his mother always had. I was undone completely, standing in a hospital on Christmas Eve, holding the son I never knew I had, mourning the woman I'd lost twice now. "Hello," I whispered, my voice breaking on that single word. And for the first time in decades, I, Edward Rothwell, feared titan of industry, felt tears slide unchecked down my face. Nurse Bennett discreetly stepped away, giving us this moment alone. The hospital continued its quiet nighttime rhythm around us, but in our corner of the neonatal unit, time seemed suspended. "I'm sorry," I whispered to him. Words meant as much for his mother as for him. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." The baby stirred slightly, tiny fingers flexing against the swaddling. I touched one finger to his palm, and he grasped it with surprising strength. A reflex, I knew, yet it felt like forgiveness I didn't deserve. I would see Julia soon. I would face that final goodbye. But for now, I held our son, this miraculous continuation of her, and felt something long dormant stir back to life within me. Something warm and frightening and necessary. He was impossibly small, swaddled tightly in a blanket with red reindeer prints, sleeping in the neonatal unit under soft lights and quiet beeps. I stood behind the glass, my hand pressed to the window like a man seeing the world for the first time. "He doesn't have a name yet," the nurse said gently. She never told us what she wanted to call him. For several minutes, I simply watched him breathe. Each tiny rise and fall of his chest seemed miraculous. I'd built skyscrapers, launched products that changed industries, yet nothing felt as monumental as this small person's existence. How had Julia carried him all these months without telling me? The question burned, but there was no one to answer it now. "Would you like to hold him again?" Nurse Bennett asked. Again. I'd already held him, hadn't I? The minutes after arriving at the hospital blurred together, a kaleidoscope of shock and grief and wonder. I nodded, suddenly desperate to feel that connection once more. She brought him to a small, private room adjacent to the neonatal unit, a space meant for new parents to bond with their babies. The walls were pale yellow, soothing. A rocking chair sat in the corner beneath a painting of ducks floating on a pond. Everything designed for joy, for beginnings, not for circumstances like mine. "Here we are," she said, placing him carefully in my arms. "Support his head like this." Her hands guided mine until I was cradling him properly. My throat tightened. I hadn't cried in years. Not when I signed the papers to acquire my father's failing company. Not when I rebuilt it into an empire. Not when I stood at his grave. Not even when Julia left. I'd prided myself on that control, that unwavering focus that made me successful in business, but I now realized a failure in everything that mattered. The baby stirred, making small movements within his tight swaddle. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, newborn blue. They would change color eventually. Would they become hazel like Julia's? Or remain blue like mine? Is he healthy? I managed to ask, suddenly terrified that he might be fragile, might slip away just as suddenly as he'd appeared in my life. "Perfectly healthy," Nurse Bennett assured me. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. All his tests have come back normal. He's a strong boy. Strong. Like his mother. Julia had always been the stronger one, though I'd never admitted it. She'd had the courage to walk away when I couldn't be what she needed. The courage to bring this child into the world alone. "I'll give you some time," the nurse said, stepping toward the door. "The call button is there if you need anything." Then it was just us. Father and son. The thought was terrifying. I knew nothing about babies. Nothing about parenting. I'd spent my life in boardrooms, not nurseries. What would I do with him? How could I possibly be what he needed? "Hello," I whispered, the word inadequate, but all I could manage. He blinked slowly, seemingly studying my face with an intensity that reminded me of Julia. She had looked at me that way, as if trying to see past my carefully constructed facade to the man underneath. The man I might have been, had life taken different turns. "I'm your father," I said, testing the word. Father. It felt foreign on my tongue. "I didn't know about you." I would have. What? What would I have done? Come back to Julia? Chosen differently? I couldn't rewrite the past now. His tiny hand escaped the swaddle, fingers splayed like starfish against the hospital blanket. I offered my index finger, and he grasped it with surprising strength. Something primal and protective surged through me. This wasn't just any child. This was my son. Mine and Julia's. The only family I had left in the world. "I have no idea what I'm doing," I confessed to him. "But I'm here now. I won't leave you." For the next hour, I simply held him, watching his expressions change as he slept, the small twitches of his lips, the flutter of his eyelids. Was he dreaming? What did newborns dream about? There was so much I didn't know, so much I needed to learn. A soft knock at the door preceded Nurse Bennett's return. Mr. Rothwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some forms. Of course, the formalities of birth and death waited for no one, not even on Christmas Eve. Would you like me to take him back to the nursery while you complete them? No, I said quickly, surprising myself with the vehemence of my response. No, he'll stay with me. She nodded, seeming pleased by my answer. I'll have someone bring the paperwork here then. When she left, I continued my one-sided conversation with my sleeping son. Your mother was remarkable, I told him. The bravest person I've ever known. She saw beauty in places I never thought to look. She changed me, though I didn't realize how much until now. He made a small sound in his sleep, almost a sigh. She deserved better than me. I continued, my voice breaking. But you deserve everything. And I promise, whatever it takes, I'll give it to you. Another knock announced a young hospital administrator with a folder of documents. Birth certificate, acknowledgement of paternity, release forms. The bureaucracy of life's most profound moments, reduced to checkboxes and signature lines. The birth certificate requires a name, she said hesitantly. A name. Julia and I had never discussed children, never reached that point in our relationship where future plans took concrete form. Yet, oddly, I knew exactly what she would have wanted to call him. Nicholas, I said, the name emerging with certainty. Nicholas Edward Harrington Rothwell. Saint Nicholas, the saint of Christmas Eve, the night he was born, the bringer of gifts. And he was that, a gift I never expected to receive. The administrator nodded, filling in the blank spaces. And you're confirming paternity? Yes. No DNA tests needed. One look at his face, my nose, my chin, Julia's delicate brow, told me everything. These forms acknowledge your legal responsibility as the father, she explained, sliding papers forward. I signed without hesitation, my signature, normally reserved for contracts worth millions, now pledging something far more valuable. My life, my future, to this child. After she left, a pediatrician came to examine Nicholas. I watched anxiously as she listened to his heart, checked his reflexes, examined his tiny perfect fingers and toes. He's doing beautifully, she assured me. We'll want to keep him for observation for another 24 hours, which is standard for newborns, but there's no reason to expect any complications. What do I need to know? I asked, suddenly overwhelmed by my ignorance. About caring for him? The doctor smiled kindly. The nurses will show you the basics: feeding, changing, bathing. There are excellent childcare classes you can take, and you'll want to find a pediatrician for follow-up care. Of course, I'd need to arrange everything. A nursery, supplies, staff. All the physical requirements were easily solved with money. But the emotional ones, how to comfort him, how to be the father he deserved, those were beyond any price tag. If you're planning to take him home yourself, she continued, rather than have a nurse or nanny do it, we recommend. I'll take him, I interrupted. The thought of delegating his care to staff, as I did with every other aspect of my life, felt suddenly wrong. I'll be the one to bring him home. She nodded, seeming pleased but slightly surprised. Wonderful. The nurses will make sure you're comfortable with all the basics before discharge. After she left, I settled back into the rocking chair, Nicholas asleep against my chest. The weight of him there felt right somehow, as if a piece I hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place. We'll figure this out, I promised him. Your mother would want me to get this right. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold beyond the hospital windows. Somewhere in the building, a choir began singing carols, volunteers bringing holiday cheer to patients unable to be home for the holiday. The sound drifted down the corridor, strains of Silent Night, reaching our quiet room. It seemed fitting somehow. This night that had changed everything. This silent communion between father and son in the early hours of Christmas. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a sense of peace, of purpose beyond profit margins and market shares. Nicholas stirred, his tiny face scrunching with what I was learning were hunger cues. A nurse had shown me how to prepare the formula, how to test the temperature, how to hold him for feeding. My first attempts had been clumsy, but now, on our third feeding, I was gaining confidence. As he drank, his eyes locked on mine with that same intense gaze that seemed too knowing for a newborn. I wondered what he saw. A stranger, certainly. A flawed man unprepared for fatherhood. But perhaps also someone trying, for the first time in years, to be better than he had been. Your mother loved Christmas, I told him softly. She decorated every corner of her flat with lights and greenery. She baked cookies for the neighborhood children. She dragged me to charity events and Christmas markets. I smiled at the memory. I complained, of course, claimed I was too busy. But secretly, I loved seeing the world through her eyes. Nicholas continued drinking, his tiny hand pressed against the bottle. We'll honor her that way, I decided aloud. Christmas will always be special for you. I promise. Later that morning, a hospital social worker came to discuss arrangements. She was professional but warm, clearly concerned about a wealthy bachelor CEO suddenly taking custody of a newborn. Mr. Rothwell, do you have support systems in place? Family or friends who can help with the baby? I thought of my empty mansion, my staff who knew nothing of children, my colleagues who saw me only as Rothwell Industries personified. I'll arrange whatever is necessary, I said firmly. She nodded, making notes. And your work schedule? Newborns require round-the-clock care. I'm taking a leave of absence, I heard myself say, the decision made in that moment. Rothwell Industries has an excellent executive team. They can manage without me for a while. Her eyebrows rose slightly. That's commendable. Still, I'd like to schedule a home visit to ensure everything is properly set up for the baby's arrival. Of course, whatever is necessary. I would pass any inspection, meet any requirement. Nothing would separate me from Nicholas now. As the day progressed, nurses came and went, teaching me diapering, swaddling, the proper way to burp him after feeding. I absorbed every instruction with the same intensity one once reserved for market analyses and business strategies. This was more important than any corporate takeover. This was my son's well-being, his future. Through it all, Nicholas remained in my arms or nearby in his bassinet. I couldn't bear to let him out of my sight, as if he might disappear as suddenly as he had entered my life. As if Julia's final gift to me might prove only a dream. I signed the papers, declared paternity, arranged for the best private care, nannies, round-the-clock security. But nothing felt real until I walked into Julia's hospital room. She wasn't there. They had already moved her. But her scent lingered. Her sweater was draped over a chair. Her lipstick sat next to a crushed water bottle. Her absence filled the room like a scream. We've kept her things for you, Nurse Bennett explained, standing at the doorway. She hesitated, then added, Take your time, Mr. Rothwell. I'll be just outside. The door closed with a soft click, and I was alone with Julia's ghost. The room was small, utilitarian, yet somehow still held echoes of her presence. A worn paperback, Steinbeck's East of Eden, lay open on the side table, a hospital bracelet marking her place. She'd always read classics during stressful times, finding comfort in well-worn pages. I touched the sweater, soft blue cashmere I remembered buying her on a weekend trip to Edinburgh. She'd protested the extravagance, then wore it constantly through 2 London winters. The fabric still held her scent, that particular blend of jasmine perfume and the lavender soap she preferred. I lifted it to my face, breathing in memories. A canvas tote bag sat on the floor beside the chair. I recognized it. She'd carried it everywhere, her portable office as she called it. Without conscious thought, I found myself kneeling beside it, hands trembling as I looked inside. Her camera, the Leica I'd gifted her on her 30th birthday, nestled among notebooks, pens, a wallet, a half-eaten packet of biscuits. The ordinary contents of an extraordinary life, now stilled. My fingers brushed against something hard at the bottom of the bag, a small wooden box I didn't recognize. I lifted it out carefully, turning it over in my hands. It was handcrafted, with intricate carvings of leaves and vines on the lid. The sort of thing Julia would have found in some obscure artisan market during her travels. Inside, a collection of ultrasound images, each labeled with dates. The earliest from just weeks after she'd left me. The most recent from only a month ago. She'd documented our son's development meticulously. In the corner of each image, she'd written notes. First heartbeat, sucking his thumb today. He has your nose, Edward. My name, written in her familiar slanted script, undid me completely. She'd thought of me during each milestone. Had she wanted to call? Had she picked up the phone a dozen times, only to set it down again? Had pride, hers or mine, kept us apart during the months she carried our child? The questions piled up with no answers forthcoming. At the bottom of the box lay a small notebook, its cover worn from frequent handling. I opened it carefully, as if it might disintegrate in my hands. It was a pregnancy journal, filled with Julia's thoughtful observations about her changing body, her hopes for the baby, her fears. June 12th. Doctor says everything looks perfect. He's growing right on schedule. I felt a move today, like butterfly wings inside me. I wonder if Edward, but no. He made his choice. I made mine. July 28th. Had to stop fieldwork today. Editor was understanding. We'll work from home until maternity leave. Baby kicks constantly now, especially when I play Bach. Already a music lover like his father. August 15th. Difficult appointment today. Blood pressure concerns. Doctor wants more monitoring. Trying not to worry. This little one deserves a peaceful journey into the world. The entries continued, documenting her journey. A journey she'd taken alone when she should have had me by her side. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. December 22nd. Blood pressure worse. Doctor recommends immediate bed rest. Hospital tomorrow, if no improvement. Little one seems unconcerned, active as ever. Christmas baby perhaps? Have arranged everything just in case. Edward's number on emergency contact. Letter in bedside drawer. If anything happens to me, I know he'll come. Whatever else he is, he's a man of honor. And he'll love our son. Of that, I'm certain. Honor. She believed I had it. Even after I chose Rothwell Industries over her. Even after I let her walk away without a fight. Her faith in me was a burden I wasn't sure I deserved to carry, yet now I must. For Nicholas. For her. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed where Julia had brought our son into the world. Where she had slipped away. The sheets had been changed, the room sanitized, but her presence lingered. I could almost hear her voice, see her smile, feel her hand on mine. The medical staff had left a folder on the bedside table, her records, her file, her end-of-life documentation. I made myself read it all, forcing myself to understand what had happened. Preeclampsia developing into eclampsia during labor. Hemorrhage. Multiple interventions. Time of death, 12:17 a.m., Christmas morning. Just 35 minutes after Nicholas was born. She'd named him, then. In those precious minutes, she held him. She'd given him life, a name, and a father before letting go. The courage that must have taken was beyond anything I could comprehend. I noticed the drawer in the bedside table was partially open. Inside, as her journal had mentioned, was an envelope with my name on it. Her handwriting, so familiar it made my heart contract painfully. I stared at it for several long minutes before I found the courage to pick it up, but I couldn't bring myself to open it yet. Some final words were too precious, too devastating to read in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and loss. I carefully gathered Julia's belongings, the sweater, the books, the bag with her camera, the box of ultrasound images, her journal, the letter. These would be Nicholas's inheritance, these glimpses of his mother. I would preserve them all, along with my own memories of her, to share with him when he was old enough to understand. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Nurse Bennett entered, her expression gentle. Mr. Rothwell, the social worker would like to speak with you about taking your son home. Reality rushed back. Nicholas, my son. In the intensity of confronting Julia's absence, I'd momentarily forgotten the urgent presence of our child. Of course, I said, standing. I'll be right there. She hesitated, then asked, would you like me to arrange transportation for Ms. Harrington's, for her remains? To a funeral home of your choosing? The question was practical, necessary, but it felt like a physical blow. Julia reduced to remains, to arrangements to be made, to one more task on an impossible list. Yes, I managed. My assistant will contact you with details. Margaret would know what to do. Margaret always knew. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed with a text from her. Car sent to your home for baby supplies. Nursery company on standby. Pediatrician secured. Take your time. Everything handled. Margaret's efficiency was legendary, but this went beyond professional competence. This was kindness. I hadn't told her about Nicholas yet, but somehow she knew, had already set wheels in motion. I made a mental note to double her already generous Christmas bonus. Before leaving Julia's room, I turned for one last look. In the corner, a small vase held a single white lily, her favorite flower. I hadn't noticed it before. Had someone brought it for her? One of the nurses, perhaps, trying to make the labor room more welcoming? Or had Julia herself brought it? A small touch of beauty to accompany her into motherhood? I would never know. Like so many questions now, it would remain unanswered. But I took the flower, careful not to crush its delicate petals. I would press it between the pages of her book, another small piece of her to preserve. In the corridor, medical staff moved efficiently, the hospital's rhythm continuing despite the profound changes in my world. Christmas Day in the maternity ward. Other babies were being born, other families celebrating new beginnings rather than mourning endings. The social worker waited in a small conference room, Nicholas asleep in a portable bassinet beside her. At the sight of him, something tight in my chest eased slightly. Here was the living proof of Julia's existence, of our brief time together. Here was my future. Mr. Rothwell, the social worker, Ms. Patel, according to her badge, greeted me. I understand you'll be taking Nicholas home tomorrow, pending final pediatric clearance? Yes. The thought was terrifying and necessary all at once. I've reviewed your paperwork. Everything seems in order legally. I do have some questions about practical arrangements, however. Her tone was professional but kind. Newborns require specialized care. Do you have experience with infants? No, I admitted. Honesty seemed the only viable approach. But I'm a quick study. She nodded, unsurprised. Will you be hiring a nanny? Eventually, yes. But for now, I surprised myself with the certainty in my voice. For now, I'll be his primary caregiver. I've taken an indefinite leave from my company. Ms. Patel couldn't quite hide her surprise. Edward Rothwell, notorious workaholic CEO, stepping away from his empire for diaper duty? The tabloids would have a field day if they knew. That's commendable, she said carefully. Though challenging. Do you have family support? Friends who might help? The question highlighted how isolated I'd become. My parents were gone. No siblings. My closest relationships were with my executive team, who were colleagues more than friends. Then there was Margaret, of course, but she had her own family. I'll manage, I said simply. Ms. Patel studied me for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. She pulled several pamphlets from her folder, sliding them across the table. New parents support groups, childcare classes, emergency contact numbers. I'd strongly recommend the classes, at minimum. I gathered the materials, oddly grateful for her practical approach. Thank you. One more thing, Mr. Rothwell. Her voice softened. I understand these are extraordinary circumstances. The loss of Ms. Harrington while gaining a son, that's a complex emotional situation. There are grief counselors available, both here at the hospital and privately. For your sake, and ultimately for Nicholas's, I'd suggest considering that resource as well. Grief counseling. The very idea seemed foreign to me. Rothwells didn't discuss feelings. We managed them, contained them, channeled them into productivity. But perhaps old patterns needed to change now. For Nicholas, I could consider it. I'll think about it, I said, which was more openness than I'd shown anyone in years. She nodded, seemingly satisfied. You can reach me at any time with questions, she said, handing me her card. Day or night. This transition won't be easy, but you're not alone in making it. Not alone. The words echoed as I looked at Nicholas, still peacefully sleeping. No, I wasn't alone anymore. I had him now. And somehow, I felt Julia's presence too, not in the painful way I'd experienced in her hospital room, but as a gentle guidance. A voice reminding me that I could be more than I had been. I didn't go home. I stayed at the hospital, in the private room they gave us. My son, slept beside me in a bassinet. I watched him all night. Every breath, every twitch, was a miracle I didn't know I was capable of receiving. Outside, snow had begun to fall, gentle and slow, like time forgiving me. The hospital had offered me accommodation in a nearby hotel. St. Vincent's had arrangements with several luxury establishments for family members of wealthy patients. But the thought of leaving Nicholas, even with the excellent hospital staff, was unbearable. Instead, the nurses had brought in a reclining chair that converted to a passable bed, positioning it next to my son's bassinet. London's lights twinkled beyond the window, the city celebrating Christmas while I sat vigil over new life and recent death. The dichotomy wasn't lost on me. Birth and loss, beginning and ending, all wrapped up in this sterile room that somehow felt like the most important place I'd ever been. Nicholas stirred occasionally, making those small mewling sounds newborns make. Each time, I leaned forward, watching him settle back into sleep, marveling at his perfection. His tiny fingers, complete with miniature nails. The soft whirl of dark hair at the crown of his head. The way his rosebud mouth worked in his sleep, dreaming perhaps of his next meal. A night nurse named Amara checked on us periodically, showing me how to change his nappy, how to swaddle him properly when he grew restless. Her gentle efficiency reminded me of Margaret. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, just quiet competence. "You're doing well," she told me around 3 a.m., after I'd successfully fed and burped Nicholas without assistance. Most new fathers are more hesitant. "I can't afford to be hesitant," I replied, settling him back in the bassinet. "He needs me to get this right." She nodded, understanding more than I'd said. "The night shift can be lonely," she offered. "If you want to talk, I'm just down the hall." I thanked her, but conversation was the last thing I wanted. The quiet suited me, gave me space to absorb the seismic changes of the past 24 hours. To contemplate the letters still burning a hole in my jacket pocket. When Nicholas finally settled into a deeper sleep around 4 a.m., I found myself drawn to the window. London on Christmas morning, eerily quiet, blanketed in snow that continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes. No cars moved on the streets below. No pedestrians hurried along the pavements. Just streetlights casting halos through the snowfall and the distant sound of bells marking the hour. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, exhaustion washing over me. When had I last slept? It seemed unimportant now. Sleep could wait. There were more pressing matters requiring my attention. Julia's letter. I couldn't postpone it any longer. I returned to the recliner, checking first that Nicholas was still peacefully asleep. Then I withdrew the envelope from my pocket, running my thumb over my name written in her distinctive handwriting. The paper inside was heavy stationery, the kind Julia preferred for important correspondence. 3 pages filled with her slanted script, the blue ink occasionally blotted where the pen had lingered too long on a word. My hands trembled slightly as I began to read. "Edward, if you're reading this, things haven't gone as I hoped. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things, but please know that our son isn't one of them. He has been my greatest joy these past months, and my greatest comfort. I debated telling you about the pregnancy after I left. Pride stopped me at first, then fear, not of you, but of disrupting the life you'd chosen. By the time I realized I should have told you regardless, complications had begun. The doctors were concerned, and I was afraid the stress of contacting you would make things worse. Perhaps that was selfish. Perhaps you deserved to know from the beginning. But I made the best decision I could with the information I had, and I have to believe it was the right one for our child. I don't write this to inflict guilt or regret. What's done is done. We both made choices that led us here. What matters now is the future, his future. Our son deserves everything we can give him, including the truth about where he comes from. Tell him about me, Edward. Tell him I loved him from the first moment I knew he existed. Tell him I sang to him every night and read him poetry in the mornings. Tell him I hoped he would have your intelligence and my curiosity, your determination and my compassion. Don't tell him we were a great love story. We both know that's not true. But tell him we respected each other. Tell him we saw the best in each other, even when we couldn't find a way forward together. Tell him he was created in kindness, if not in perfect love. I have no right to ask anything more of you. You didn't sign up for fatherhood, didn't have any say in bringing him into the world. If you choose to place him for adoption, I would understand. There are excellent agencies, loving families waiting for a child. He would be wanted, cherished. But if you're reading this, it means you came when they called. It means something in you responded to the news of his birth. And I believe, I have to believe, that if you see him, hold him, you'll know what I've known these 9 months. That he is a gift beyond measure. If you choose to be his father, know that it will change you. Children have a way of rearranging your priorities, of making you question everything you thought was important. Let that happen, Edward. Let him soften the hard edges you've built around yourself. Let him teach you about what really matters. Practical matters. There's a storage unit at Kensington Lock and Key, number 237, code 0394. It contains everything I've prepared for him: clothes, books, the furniture I'd begun collecting for his nursery. My flat in Camden is paid through March. My solicitor, Daniel Whitman, contacted my phone, has my will and insurance information. Everything I have goes to our son. Edward, I need you to promise me something. Whatever path you choose with him, make sure he knows wonder. Make sure Christmas is magical for him. Make sure he looks at stars and asks questions and believes, at least for a little while, in things he can't see. I grew up with that gift, and it sustained me through the darkest times. I want that for him too. I'm not angry with you. I'm not bitter about the choices we made. Life is too short for regret, and whatever time I've had with our son has been worth every moment of pain. Be happy, Edward. Let yourself love him. He will save you in ways you don't understand yet. Always, Julia P.S. I've called him Nicholas in my heart these months. After St. Nicholas, patron of children. After my grandfather who taught me to see beauty in small things. But his name is yours to give now. Choose wisely. Names have power. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Julia's voice so clear in my head it was as if she sat beside me, speaking the words aloud. No recriminations. No bitterness. Just care for our son and, somehow, for me as well. Even after everything. Nicholas stirred in his sleep, one tiny hand escaping the swaddle to wave in the air. I carefully tucked it back beneath the blanket, my vision blurring with unshed tears. Nicholas, I whispered, testing the name she'd chosen. It suited him. St. Nicholas, the bringer of gifts on Christmas. And he was that, the greatest gift I'd never expected to receive. Morning light was beginning to filter through the window, the sky transitioning from black to deep blue to the pale gray of a London winter dawn. Christmas Day, while families across the city woke to presents and celebration, I sat in silent communion with my newborn son, contemplating a future that looked nothing like I'd imagined 24 hours ago. I would keep her letter always. Someday, when Nicholas was old enough, I would share it with him, let him know his mother through her own words. But for now, I carefully folded the pages and returned them to the envelope, placing it in my inner jacket pocket, close to my heart. The letter had answered some questions, but created others. What kind of father would I be? How would I balance the demands of Rothwell Industries with the needs of an infant? What would the press say when they inevitably discovered my situation? The practicalities were daunting, but beneath the logistics and complications, something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The ambition that had driven me for decades, the relentless push for more power, more wealth, more control, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the simple rise and fall of Nicholas's chest as he slept. Nurse Amara returned around 6, carrying a tray with toast, fruit, and coffee. Thought you might need this, she said, setting it on the small table beside me. How was your night? Enlightening. I replied, the word inadequate but true. She checked Nicholas, her movements practiced and gentle. He's doing beautifully. The pediatrician will be by after breakfast rounds, but I don't anticipate any issues with discharge later today. Today, we would leave the hospital today, step out into the world as father and son. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Is there someone who can help you at home? She asked, echoing the social worker's concerns from yesterday. The first few days can be overwhelming, especially for a single parent. Home. The word conjured images of my Belgravia mansion, cold and formal, with its museum-quality art and antiques that had been selected for investment value rather than comfort. It was no place for a child. We won't be going to my house, I said, the decision forming as I spoke. Not at first. Julia's flat in Camden, warm, cluttered, alive with colors and textures. That would be a better environment for Nicholas. She'd begun preparing it for him. Her letter mentioned furniture, clothes, books she'd collected. The start of a nursery. I'll need to make arrangements, I told the nurse. Is there a private room where I could make some calls? She directed me to a small consultation room 2 doors down, promising to watch Nicholas while I attended to practicalities. With one last glance at my sleeping son, I stepped into the hallway, already dialing Margaret's number. She answered on the first ring, despite the early hour on Christmas Day. Sir, how are you? The simple question nearly undid me. How was I? Transformed. Broken open. Remaking myself with every breath. I need your help, Margaret, I said instead of answering. Non-standard arrangements. Of course. No questions, no surprise. Just immediate readiness. I'd never appreciated her more. I have a son, I said, the word still strange on my tongue. Born last night. His mother didn't survive. The clinical phrase was easier than saying Julia was gone. To Margaret's credit, she absorbed this information without audible reaction. I see. How can I assist? We'll be leaving the hospital today. I need Julia Harrington's flat in Camden made ready for an infant. She had begun preparations, but I don't know what's still needed. Ms. Harrington's flat, Margaret repeated, and I could hear her making notes. Camden. Address. I realized I didn't know. 3 years since I'd visited her there, and the specific location had faded from memory. Check her emergency contact information in the Rothwell personnel archives, I instructed. She did freelance photography for our annual report in 2021. I'll locate it, Margaret assured me. What else? Contact Daniel Whitman, her solicitor. His information is in her phone, which is among her personal effects here. I'll need him to provide access to a storage unit she mentioned. I paused, considering what else Nicholas would need immediately, and arrange for delivery of whatever infant supplies might not be at the flat already. Formula, nappies, that sort of thing. Consider it done. Shall I send Giles with the car around noon? Yes. I hesitated, then added. The press will discover this soon enough. Prepare a statement, but don't release it yet. I want a few days of privacy first. Understood. She paused, then added with uncharacteristic gentleness. Congratulations, sir, on your son. The simple acknowledgement brought an unexpected lump to my throat. Thank you, Margaret. And I rarely said the words. I appreciate your assistance. Especially today. It's nothing, sir. My own plans were just the usual with my sister's family. They'll understand. I ended the call, making a mental note to ensure Margaret's Christmas was properly compensated for this interruption. Then I made one more call, to my CFO, Simon Wells. Edward. He sounded surprised to hear from me on Christmas morning. Is something wrong? No emergency, I assured him. But I'm taking an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately. You'll need to assume operations until further notice. The silence that followed spoke volumes. In 20 years at Rothwell Industries, I'd never taken more than a weekend off. May I ask why? He finally managed. Personal matters, I said simply. I'll explain more later. For now, I need you to reschedule my meetings for the next month, minimum. Delegate where possible, postpone where necessary. But the Singapore merger will proceed according to plan, with you leading instead of me. My tone brooked no argument. This isn't negotiable, Simon. He agreed, of course. One didn't refuse Edward Rothwell, but the confusion in his voice was evident. The business world would be rife with speculation by tomorrow. Edward Rothwell, walking away from his empire at the height of expansion? It was unprecedented. Yet as I ended the call and returned to Nicholas's room, I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, Rothwell Industries wasn't my primary concern. For once, someone mattered more. Nicholas was awake when I returned, his unfocused blue eyes blinking up at the ceiling. I stood over his bassinet, watching as he discovered his hands, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling in the sunlight now streaming through the window. Good morning, I said softly. It's Christmas Day, your first Christmas. I reached down, offering my finger, which he grasped reflexively. And we're going home today. Not to my home, but to your mother's. I think you'll like it there. He made a small sound, not quite a coo, not quite a cry. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of plans being made, of futures unfolding, of lives changing course on this longest night that had become the first morning of something new. By New Year's, the papers called it the most unexpected story of the year. Billionaire CEO adopts own child after secret birth. The press speculated. The markets moved, but none of it mattered. I was too busy learning how to swaddle, how to sing lullabies I never thought I'd sing, how to be a father. The Financial Times ran it as a secondary headline, tucked beneath analysis of year-end market fluctuations. The tabloids were less restrained. My face plastered across the sun with the headline, Rothwell's Secret Love Child, in screaming capitals. Someone had managed to unearth a photo of Julia and me at the Royal Opera House 2 years prior, her head thrown back in laughter at something I'd said, my expression softer than I'd ever allowed in public. Rothwell Industries stock dipped briefly, then rallied when Simon assured investors that the company remained in capable hands despite my sudden leave of absence. The business world buzzed with theories: midlife crisis, health scare, corporate scandal. None came close to the simple truth. I'd become a father and chosen, for once, the more important role. Julia's flat in Camden turned out to be a second-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian, its red brick exterior weathered but solid. Inside, it was exactly as I remembered, walls painted in warm yellows and blues, bookshelves overflowing, photographs everywhere. Her life's work displayed in black and white. Refugees in Greece, protesters in Ukraine, everyday moments of extraordinary human resilience. The spare bedroom had been partially converted into a nursery. A white crib stood assembled against one wall, a mobile of fabric stars hanging above it. A changing table, still in its box. Bags from baby shops containing tiny clothes, blankets, soft toys. She'd been preparing, even as her health declined. Even as she faced the possibility she wouldn't live to see our son grow. Margaret had worked miracles, as always. By the time Giles drove us from the hospital on Christmas afternoon, the flat was stocked with everything an infant might need. Formula, nappies, wipes, more clothes, a rocking chair hastily delivered from Harrods. She'd even found a night nurse willing to start immediately, though I sent the woman home after just one shift. I wanted to do this myself, at least at first. Needed to really. Those first days passed in a blur of feedings and nappy changes, of precious little sleep and constant discovery. Nicholas's cry when he was hungry differed from his cry when he needed changing. He preferred being swaddled with his right arm free. He settled best when held against my shoulder, my heartbeat lulling him to sleep. I called him Nicholas, as Julia had wished. Nicholas Edward Harrington Rothwell, a name that honored both his lineage and his future. The official birth certificate arrived on December 28th, the document making real what still sometimes felt like a dream. I was a father. This child was mine. Everything had changed. Daniel Whitman, Julia's solicitor, came to the flat on New Year's Eve. A serious young man with kind eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, he brought Julia's will and life insurance documents as promised. Everything was in order, everything left to Nicholas. Her flat, her photography archives, and future royalties. A modest savings account. A letter for Nicholas to read on his 18th birthday, which Daniel placed in my care with solemn ceremony. She was very clear about her wishes, he told me. Accepting tea in Julia's cluttered kitchen while Nicholas slept in the bassinet, I'd moved to keep him near me. She wanted no extraordinary measures if complications arose, but everything possible done for the baby. When did she know? I asked, the question that had haunted me since Christmas Eve. About the complications, I mean. She was informed of the risks early in the third trimester, Daniel said carefully. Her blood pressure had been concerning throughout, but became critical around Thanksgiving. The doctors recommended terminating the pregnancy at that point. She refused. The knowledge settled heavily in my chest. Julia had knowingly risked her life to bring our son into the world, had made her peace with the possibility she wouldn't survive to raise him, had trusted me to step in if necessary, despite everything. She was the bravest person I've ever known, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. She spoke of you, you know. Not often, but enough. She never regretted your time together. I hadn't earned such grace, such forgiveness. But I would try to deserve it now, for Nicholas's sake. The solicitor departed, leaving me with legal custody of my son and a weight of responsibility unlike anything I'd known in business. This wasn't a company I could delegate or an asset I could liquidate if things went poorly. This was a life entrusted to my care. That night, as London celebrated the arrival of a new year with fireworks visible from Julia's small balcony, I held Nicholas against my chest and made silent promises. To protect him, to guide him, to ensure he knew his mother's courage and creativity, to be present in ways I'd never been before. Margaret called just after midnight, the sounds of a family celebration in the background. Just checking if you need anything, sir, she said, professional as always despite the hour and the holiday. We're fine, Margaret, I assured her. How are the preparations coming for the press statement? Draft completed. I've taken the liberty of engaging Hardwick PR to manage the announcement. They suggest a simple written statement rather than a press conference. Good. The last thing I wanted was cameras in my face, invasive questions about Julia, about my plans for Nicholas. Schedule it for January 2nd. And Margaret? Take the next week off. Paid holiday. I could almost hear her processing this unprecedented directive. In 15 years, Margaret had never taken an unscheduled day off. Sir, are you certain? The media response will be considerable. I'm certain, I said firmly. I need to learn to manage without you hovering. Consider it professional development for us both. Nicholas stirred against my chest, making the small noises that usually preceded a hungry cry. I need to go, I told Margaret. Happy New Year. The statement, when released, was appropriately vague. It acknowledged the birth of my son, expressed deep sadness at the passing of his mother, unnamed in the release, and requested privacy during this time of adjustment. It confirmed my temporary leave from Rothwell Industries and expressed complete confidence in the executive team. The press did their usual digging, of course. Julia's obituary in The Guardian, written by her editor, a lovely piece that highlighted her award-winning photography without mentioning her connection to me, gave them a starting point. By January 3rd, they had the full story, or a version of it. Julia's name and photograph appeared alongside mine in the business sections and tabloids alike. I ignored it all, focused solely on the small universe that had become my life in Camden. I learned to function on fractured sleep, to interpret Nicholas's different cries, to find joy in the simple miracle of his existence. I spoke to him constantly, telling him about Julia, about the world he'd someday explore, about anything and everything that came to mind. Simon called weekly with Rothwell updates, clearly expecting each time that I'd announce my return date. But as January turned to February, I found myself increasingly reluctant to resume my former life. The empire I'd built, once all-consuming, now seemed distant and strangely unimportant compared to Nicholas's first smile, his strengthening grasp, his widening awareness of the world. By March, decisions could no longer be postponed. Julia's lease on the Camden flat was ending. Nicholas was out.